have
All
to
right, go
quickly
for it.
continue. Very good. Okay, so welcome and thank you everyone for participating. And we thought maybe the first thing that we would do is just go around and as briefly as I mean, you guys have these incredible bios that I'm looking at, but if we could just quickly hear a little bit about who you are and what you've been up to for your life, and that would be great. Can Sean Doherty, can you start off?
Sure. Thanks, Bob. Well, I'll try and get my 66 years of experience in 30 seconds or less. Basically, I was a government employee for 35 years. I retired in the end of 2012. Prior to that, I spent 3 years in the military, in the U.S. Army as a military policeman. I spent a year and a half in Northeast Thailand. My federal agency experience with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Before Homeland Security, we were under Department of Treasury as the U.S. Customs Service. So I spent 35 years doing that work. It was very rewarding and exciting work, and it was a lot of fun. So that's it in 30 seconds or less.
Thank you. That was perfect. Ben, how about you?
I'm a cinematographer, been working in the film industry for a number of years. I teach at Montclair State University in their film department. And yeah, been fortunate that the work I do does take me around the world, take me around the country. And yeah, it's been a strange life, but a good one.
Terrific, thank you. Sean Campbell.
Yes, hi, I'm Sean. This is my 1-year-old daughter, Serafina, who'll be joining us for a little while. I'm from New Jersey at the moment, down in Norfolk, Virginia, where my wife is stationed in the Navy. So that's brought us down here for a while. I'm a venture capital attorney with a firm Lowenstein Sandler out of New Jersey, and just always had an interest in government and history and these topics, and always interested in trying to find some common sense solutions. So it's a great panel to be a part of.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I'm Robert Shanbaum, and I'm going to try to moderate. If you'll notice me looking off to the side here, it's because I have another screen here that I have notes and things on. So that's why I'm looking that way. I'm not. No one's making any signs at me or anything like that. But I have been in the software business most of my career for about over 30 years anyway. Making software for making eyeglasses. Somewhere along the way, actually, when I was 54 years old, I went to law school at night and got a law degree and went absolutely insane studying for the bar and passed it, but I've never actually practiced law. So my day job was too good. And I just retired from that last year, right into the pandemic. It was like the weirdest retirement ever, I think. But so that's what I did. I got interested in law in part because of the 2000 election, because after that election, I started looking at the Florida election statutes. And as I said in that blurb I wrote, my reaction was, who writes this stuff? It was just, to the extent that it was intelligible at all, it was incoherent. So anyway, I eventually went to law school, in part because of that. And I, as I said, I was a bit interested in elections from that point on, and how we how we go about doing it, and I guess I've been thinking about it ever since. And of course, the recent one had its own special features, and so it seemed to me that it might be interesting to get together with people and talk about it, especially people who will disagree with me. I really enjoy talking to people who disagree with me. I learn a lot more from people who disagree with me than I do from people who agree with me. So I'm looking forward to that kind of thing. As you know, I did produce a kind of outline of this that just sort of steps through what I saw as the various phases involved in our voting system. from registration, starting with registration. I mean, theoretically, it all starts there anyway. If you're not registered, you can't vote, and at least that's the way it's supposed to work. And I think that most, in most locations, I think that's absolutely true. I don't know if anyone would disagree with that. That if you're not registered, you're just not going to vote. And so I thought we would just start with that and see if there are things about registration that we could talk about. And I thought I would start by suggesting something that I figure everybody's going to disagree with. So, which is, it seems to me that part of the problem with registration is identification. And in this country, we really don't have any formal centralized identification system for us. You don't necessarily know who someone is. The IRS has records, Social Security has records, Medicare may have records. In my case, Selective Service used to have records. The town of Manchester here in Connecticut, where I'm located, they have a record on me, which is different from the one that the Department of Revenue Services here in Connecticut has on me. And so it seemed to me that as long as we have that kind of situation, it's going to be really hard to have a really robust identification system. So I would like to see us actually have a national identification system. I'd like for there to be a single database, which by that I mean logically speaking, not necessarily physically speaking, but a database that contains all of this kind of information about us, whether it's voting or where's your driver's license, where's your domicile? I mean, which would have an impact on voting and where you pay taxes, but all of those sorts of things, so that, and then, are you alive? I mean, when you die, what does the coroner do? Or the town clerk do when the death is recorded? It would be really nice if there were a database somewhere where he could send a message, had to send a message that said, "Hey, this guy's dead now," and there wouldn't be any ambiguity about who's alive and who's dead if that record shows that. So I think that's, to me, that's kind of maybe an essential part of having a really robust system. So what do you guys think of that? Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in.
John Doherty.
All right. I don't agree with a national ID or national database for a few reasons. I think, first of all, I think there's privacy issues concerns there as far as identifying every single person with one uniform ID card. I know a number of countries have it. I think the closest thing we have right now is Social Security. There is a database pretty much on everybody in this country that's working legally. I know my daughter just had a baby a month ago, and her Social Security card just showed up in the mail the other day. So the baby is already registered with the government. And it's a unique ID that's going to be with that baby for the rest of his or her life. And I think that's about as all and it serves multiple purposes. It's not just used for voting. So I think that's the database that we already have in place, and I don't think there's a need to create another one. Now you can say, well, it doesn't have a photo ID on it. Well, you have other backup forms of ID that are government issued. There's the passport that everybody has if you travel at all. Most people have it. Even if they don't travel, they get one just in case they have to travel. They have driver's license, state issued a driver's license with a photo on it that is probably more controlled than any federal ID because it's more localized. It's limited to the people in your state, and it's more controlled, and it's more easily verified than a national ID. People are moving around from state to state, and a national ID, I think, is just redundant based on what we already have. And I think then eventually knowing how the government works, those things do get abused. And that would be my fear. And the fact that the government would take it to another level and abuse it in some fashion. I just don't trust the way the government operates when they have their hands on information because it gets misused for other reasons. Not with bad intent, they usually have good intentions, but unfortunately, their good intentions then infringe upon our rights as individuals. And that's a piece on that one.
Okay. Anyone?
I would tend to agree with that 100%. Both the redundancy piece and the privacy piece, I think, were the two concerns that popped into my mind, and the reality that, just based on how things operate here, I think, election law tends to be something that's regulated at the state level, and I think the more we start to federalize these things, perhaps someone would argue that there are merits to that, but it also definitely changes the dynamics of elections significantly from what we've been doing since the founding of the country.
Mhm.
Ben?
Also, the Social Security functions very well as a centralized bit of data for all of us. And I was looking over the New York State requirements, and honestly, I had to be reminded what I did because it was so many years ago. But it was driver's license and Social Security card, and then if you don't have a driver's license, there are other photo IDs one can bring in. And I know I had voted, I'd registered in New Jersey because that's where I grew up. Then I moved to Chicago for school. I registered there. And then I moved here to New York City and I registered here. I did it 3 times. I have no idea what I did, but I don't think it was terribly onerous. If it was really bad, I certainly would have remembered it because I tend to hold grudges. So it seems like it's all doable. And again, the idea of local, when you were worried about, when does the coroner know you've died? Well, it would seem that the first people who would know would be your locality. So if you had to kick it all the way upstairs to the federal level and then work it back down, it seems kind of inefficient. And, I did go to school in Chicago and we did learn vote early, vote often. And we did learn about, getting all the names from the cemeteries. And I did that for plenty of politicians. No, I did not. I miss those good old days. I miss those good old days.
Sean over here is going to arrest you if you keep going.
But I'd love to raise a hypothetical. Well, it's actually not a hypothetical. It kind of happened last week. It ties into a few of these things and perhaps leaps into some of the other topics. So, I have a place in New Jersey that I own, and my wife owns a place in Virginia where she's stationed, and so I'm a resident of New Jersey. So I go to do an absentee ballot a couple weeks ago for the Republican primary, and then that all goes fine, and then mailed to my residence in New Jersey. My mother is a tenant, so to speak. My mother's living in my place in New Jersey right now, so they're automatically mailing all the absentee ballots out. So they mail a ballot for her, which makes sense. They mail a ballot for me, which I guess makes sense, but I also just did this absentee ballot thing with Virginia, so now there's kind of 2 ballots out there, but okay. And then the absurd thing though was that they mail my younger brother a ballot. Now here's the thing: he has lived in Maryland, and he's a homeowner in Maryland, and has lived there for 5 years, has a Maryland driver's license, last lived with my mother, at least, 5 years ago, and certainly never lived at the address where they mailed his mail-in ballot. He's not a resident of the state anymore, and he never lived at the address because the condo was purchased 1.5 years ago. So I have absolutely no idea how he wound up with a mail-in ballot for the Republican or Democratic primary, I'm not sure which, probably the Democratic primary in his case, but I don't know how he wound up with this ballot. And so, again, not saying anything nefarious, but it just seems to me like a bureaucratic incompetence that, you know, this is the kind of stuff that I think frustrates people and starts to lead to distrust, even if that materially doesn't make the change in a single election. I found it very, very frustrating that that this happened. And this, and it does make you wonder, how often does stuff like this happen? Because even if you took this election security laws in Georgia, that if you have a mail-in ballot, you have to include a social security number to bring our point. I know the last four digits of his social security number, and I could very easily fill that out. And I don't know if I have to sign it, and then they maybe match the signatures, maybe not. I don't think bureaucrats are handwriting experts necessarily, but it would be very easy for me to just send that in, and because I do know the last, even though New Jersey doesn't require the last four digits, even in a state like Georgia, I could mail this in, and that was, you know, those are presumably supposed to be very tough election laws. So I say that with no political bent, but just the idea that it was a hypothetical that wasn't hypothetical. It happened, and it, you know, concerned me, and it happened a week before this panel. So I thought it was an interesting thing to raise.
That is interesting. I'd be really curious to find out how your brother got registered.
I know he didn't do the.
If he didn't do the registering, how the heck did he get
once registered in New Jersey, and I'm sure he never took any action to unregister, because who does that? But the fact is, like, what I would advocate is that every election, the voter has to do something to activate the process. I do want to make voting easier for people. I don't want to let voting, but I do think that even if you're registered, there has to be something every election that activates the process, whether it's you going to the election booth or whether it's you requesting the absentee ballot or something, but it has to be activated, I feel. And I think that was probably always the case, but now in the last, 2 years or so, or last couple of years, where we're changing some things, maybe these are things we need to address. I'll be right there.
Sure.
Oh wait, you drop something like that and then run off. Is that it? Is that what?
That was my mic drop moment.
Yes.
So it's interesting that you bring that up, because one of the reasons that I mentioned all the places I've lived is that I have voted in 4 different states, and most recently I was my domicile. We moved our domicile to Florida about 5 years ago. We bought a house there that was supposed to be a winter home, and decided to make it our domicile. And so we changed to voting down there. And then last year we decided to move back up here, make this our domicile again. And when we moved back up, a few interesting things happened. One, because in part because of the pandemic, we moved back up here and couldn't get an appointment with DMV to change our driver's licenses right away. And they had relaxed the laws. It's you're supposed to do it within 30 days. They said, well, don't worry about that. You got to make an appointment, So it took, 6 or 8 weeks or something for us to get to the DMV, to change our driver's licenses. We do that. And in Connecticut, when you get a driver's license or make a change to a driver's license, you visit the DMV, you can register to vote. And so we said, great, we'll do it right now. That'll save us time. And so a few things happened that struck me as curious. Now, I figured, as I think most people would, that, they take my Florida driver's license and give me a Connecticut driver's license. So I don't have two driver's licenses. And they said that, Florida will get the message about your change of domicile, and they'll take you off the voter rolls. Well, a few days later, I get a letter from the town of Manchester registrar of voters saying that, okay, they'd recorded a change to my voting status in Manchester, that they changed my address. I'm thinking, didn't you register me anew here? And apparently I had been registered to vote all that time in Manchester while I was registered to vote in Florida. And and I actually called the registrar and asked him about this, and he said, well, you know, the system of communicating between and among the states doesn't work all that well, apparently. In fact, in Florida, the way that Florida discovered that I was no longer a resident of Florida, well, they didn't actually discover it with this. They sent me a ballot because I was signed up to vote by mail, just as a matter of course, because you could do that in Florida. You can't do it in Connecticut. But in Florida, you have the option of voting by mail. So signed up for that. I think every time there's an election, they'll send you a ballot and ask if you want to continue. When you return it, there's like a checkbox somewhere on the ballot that you, maybe on the envelope, the outer envelope that you return or something, inner envelope, outer envelope one, that you check and say, yeah, I want to continue to vote by mail. So the next time there's an election, they'll send you a ballot again. Seemed to work fine to me. You know, I found it very convenient. There was a drop box. The elections office was actually not far from my office. So it was just really easy for me to fill out the ballot, put it in the envelope, sign it carefully, try to make, yeah, this is my signature, and drop it off. And so, you know, it was very easy. Well, point of this is, though, they got it back because I was forwarding mail, and the post office knows you don't forward a ballot when when there's a forwarding order on an address. And so they got it back and sent me a postcard saying, hey, did you move, or do you, there were a couple of options on this postcard to return to them. You know, did you move, or did you leave the state, or I don't remember what the other options were. So that's the only way. The fact that I was voting by mail was really the only way up until that point that Florida found out that I didn't live there anymore. So it was kind of, it actually provided something of a check to them that, you know, sending the ballot out and getting it back, that's how they knew that I wasn't there anymore. But I said when I made that suggestion about ID, I said that you were all going to probably disagree with it, but I think it's great that you're all coming together. Just you know, on the first question, here we are, you know, coming together on that. I think it's certainly true that we have a social security number. Of course, I'm old enough to remember that it used to say not for identification on the social security card. It doesn't say that anymore. But you know, would it be so different if you know, when it comes to privacy issues, everybody has all this information. How is it more private to have, you know, half a dozen or 10 agencies have all of my information than it would be if they were all getting that information from one place? And that's really, you know, again, I'm thinking about this as a software developer. You know, I could make a connection to another system and get an address. I mean, this happens all the time. Whenever you put your address into if you put your address into Amazon, it's going to call a commercial service that's just got everybody's address to make sure that that's a valid address, and it'll come back. Do you want to use this address? You know, you can do that sort of thing. So I'm not sure where you gain additional privacy by having more agencies have your information, and thus making your job more complicated every time you move. You've got to go make sure you change your address in all of these different places. But I'm not surprised that you know that's your reaction, but it does strike me as, how do I gain privacy by having, you know, more individual agencies have my personal information?
Bob, may I just jump in for a second?
Sure, Sean Doherty.
Yeah, I think my point was, I just didn't think we needed another ID card to carry around with us. You know, we didn't need another form of ID.
Yeah.
What I was thinking as you were speaking, what was going through my mind was, and the issues with people moving around as we move from state to state, and people have relocated, as we've just discussed. Everybody here has probably moved 2 or 3 times at least in their lifetime. And these moves complicate these types of issues when you're trying to register in a state-run system that doesn't talk to the other states.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem. There is no communication between them. Now, I have no problem with taking, just as an idea, you know, Social Security has their website, and I go on it because now I'm getting my Medicare as well. And it's all tied in, and you have a profile in there. And it's tied to your Social Security and your Medicare. And I can't see why they couldn't just add another box in there or create a voter profile where you would fill out what party you want to register under and what state you live in. And you would check those two boxes. And if you moved, you could go back into your profile and change it from Florida to New York. And that would solve it. And then those states, the respective states' databases would be automatically updated. There wouldn't be a need to purge or try and find out who's still living in Florida and who moved back to New York and vice versa. The individual would control that himself. You know, when you move, as we all know, you move, you have to change your credit card, everything that you own, pretty much. You have to go back in your bank accounts, your credit cards, everything else that's related to your address, you have to go in and update.
Yeah.
And so this would be just another step, and it's not something that would have to be done immediately. You know, I don't go in there all the time, but when you do go in, there would be a reminder on there saying, you know, please keep your profile updated, your voter profile updated. As you came close to a general election, you might get an email reminder saying, please make sure your voter profile has been updated and is current. And it would remind people to go back in and make sure and verify, hey, yeah, I'm living in New York, I'm registered in New York, and everything's square, so I'm going to get access to a ballot. I think that's the kind of thing. I mean, today's world, I can't believe that we're still operating with the technology that we have available to us, that we're still operating in these archaic systems. You know, it's almost like we're still in the paper world, and the world has moved on, and you can see it every day in everything that we do. You know, Apple's done all sorts of crazy things where you're paying bills with your watch now. You know, you go up to with your watch. It reminds me of the old Dick Tracy cartoons, you know, when he had that wristwatch that he used to talk to, we used to laugh about. It's here, you know. So I mean, this stuff is here. But now you look at when a sovereign, and I respect state sovereignty, and I'm not looking to stomp on those things either. We have to respect those as well. But I think a national database where the individual will have access to it, could update it and keep it, and it would solve a lot of these issues.
Thank you. Sean Campbell.
Yeah, I mean, look, I appreciate the practical nature of that. Certainly, I think there's that makes a lot of sense. I guess again, I haven't thought through it in depth. The thing that comes to mind is like, if you're having a local school board election in a town, right? Let's think of like the most local election possible. It's hard to, I guess, reconcile, you know, where how a federal database would then connect with this, like a school board election, and what that might look like, and just, you know, I also, again, this doesn't mean that what you're saying isn't common sense, but I don't even know if the Constitution would allow there to be that level of federal involvement in local elections, even to the point of you know, regulating the voters. I think you would actually, I don't know, I'd have to really research the thought and the question, but I feel like there would be a interesting constitutional question there at minimum, which again is not to say that the idea doesn't have merit. It's just to say that there's this whole other consideration that I'm still navigating about, you know, thinking about it from the perspective of the most local election possible. I'm thinking of the school board election and how this would play out. So I just put that out there as a thought more than an answer to anything. But I do think that we've all now cited like issues with something moving between states, and obviously there's definitely a need for I don't know, states at least to be able to communicate with each other, and you know, if states are interacting with each other and on their own volition, that would certainly be.
Well, I was thinking that, and I'm sorry, I guess I wasn't clear in the first place. I really wasn't necessarily thinking of an additional database. I think already you have, for example, I'm pretty sure, not absolutely certain because I've never worked for them, I'm pretty sure that Medicare gets a lot of its information from the Social Security database. And I can't even tell you exactly why I think that, but I remember doing something when I was signing up for Medicare that said, oh, okay, they're getting that from Social Security. Now I understand. Yeah, but the idea of expanding, I mean, I think it's perfectly consistent with what I was suggesting, to expand, say, the Social Security database to include the kind of information that you're talking about. And I agree with you, Sean Campbell, that as far as the constitutional question, you know, it is the kind of thing, well, certainly it would be constitutional for federal elections. And you're right, you know, what about a school board election? Although I'm not necessarily thinking about it in the context of simply the election,
Right.
as opposed to registration. And so presumably at some point during the pre-election process, you know, the agencies that are doing this in our town, it's the town registrar of voters office that does this kind of thing, that there's stuff that they start doing in anticipation of an election. And at that point, I would think that one of the things that they could do would be to synchronize their data, assuming that they had an identifier for me, like my Social Security number. They could go simply call the Social Security computer and say, okay, what's this guy's address right now? And if it's not the same as my address was, then one of them might even, you know, it might even go to a human being and say, go do something about this and find out whether this guy's still here or not. And it does, that sort of thing would solve, you know, one of the contentious issues that comes along are these purges, which, because you don't have updated information, I mean, you're gonna have dead people on the voter rolls, and you're gonna have people who aren't living in that state anymore on the voter rolls. So it's not like it's a totally illegitimate idea to purge the voter rolls. If you haven't heard from, you know, you haven't had somebody vote for 10 years or something, you know, what's the argument against taking that person off the rolls? Well, we only have to do that sort of thing because we don't have a coherent system in the first place. If we had, you know, a single place where we could go and get this information. And of course, as far as the constitutional question is concerned, the states could always do it voluntarily. There would be nothing.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking
from doing that.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
right.
So that's possible. But so good. I mean, you know, I think that after talking it through, Ben, did you have anything you wanted to add about that?
Well, only in that since our system is so split among a federal and all these different states and localities and everything else, I guess for some, there were reports of this country tried to hack into our system and that country tried to hack into the system, and they found vulnerabilities. But because we're such a mess, they couldn't just go to one place and screw everything up. So maybe this being spread out amongst a lot of things and being in the paper world, just a tiny bit, just the bare minimum, being in that paper world might save us some headaches in this new 21st century cyber, you know, whatever. So maybe there's a tiny bit for antiquated, even though I do edit on computer, I do email, and somehow there's a tiny bit in the back of my brain that's a tiny bit Luddite. So maybe I'm holding on to that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I remember doing some work for a major retailer, and they really depended on our system to do business. And when it went down one time, I mean, it wasn't a hacking thing or anything like that. There was some, you know, hardware failure somewhere that wasn't just properly made redundant. And they didn't have any paper forms. And I was just, you know, what were they thinking? You know, they couldn't do business. They had no order forms and receipts, and you got to be able to keep on doing business, right? And they couldn't do it, you know. So, you know, for an afternoon, they just, you know, sorry, can you come back tomorrow? Okay. So I think, yeah, there's certainly merit in that, and that is a disadvantage of doing something that is so centralized. And I think from a technical standpoint, yeah, it has to be. It can't, as I suggested, I think in the first place, it can't be a single physical database somewhere. That, you know, it's got to be replicated all over the place, and you got to make sure that you got the whole thing, you know, behind a firewall, a really serious firewall, like the most serious firewall ever. But so yeah, there are some disadvantages to that. But it seems to me that kind of thing makes, hopefully, as we'll see, might make possible some, just to get rid of some issues such as this whole thing about purging voter rolls. I mean, why would you purge them if you're getting a reliable message on when people move and when people die and that sort of thing? You just wouldn't need to do it. It wouldn't be an issue. I would think, at least that's kind of the objective.
It'd be amazing if more conversations about elections these days could be as almost technical and almost dry as this. It's amazing how we're able to just think about these things from a technical perspective without politics, which makes.
Well, I tend to look at everything as an engineering problem.
Right. Well, that would be refreshing. I think right now it should be common sense to want accurate, safe, and secure elections that don't disenfranchise people. I think that would be nice. And I think that if everyone was talking about it from an engineering perspective, perhaps with those overarching goals in mind, and I don't know, people who had different motives were not the loudest voices on this, and the engineers were the ones, using the word engineer loosely here. The engineers were the ones doing this. This stuff can be figured out. This really doesn't have to be complicated.
So you're saying the engineers
it's about figuring. It's about what's complicated. What's complicated maybe is figuring out. All right, what kind of, how do you figure out the software, or how do you figure out the technical system behind doing this? But really the goals don't have to be so difficult.
Right.
The engineering is where the nuance has to come, and where we actually do need some subject matter experts to figure out, like, okay, let's figure out a way to, if we need states to talk more to each other about these things, like, let's do this. Because look, that issue comes across many industries. I mean, I think about like licensing for, to go off topic for a second, like licensing for healthcare, where, in our federalist system, we have, every state, we don't have a national way of licensing doctors, let's say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every state has its own licensing board, and that's fine from a federalist, perspective. But then if one doctor is, going to go from New York to Florida for 6 months, are they licensed there? Is the licensing different? I deal with this with law being in Virginia. Like, where's the licensing? And you see now, especially in a post-COVID environment, that states are actually starting to work together on things to streamline this stuff. And you wonder if, like, my point being that when you look at when we've identified the issue of states communicating with each other, there can be solutions to that, and those solutions don't have to be political. And I think much of this stuff can be addressed in that way, with that same spirit in mind.
Yeah. I think so. And I mean, look, I'm not. When I was thinking about this earlier, it occurred to me that, I mean, I can look at some of these issues, some of the questions that have come along the recent weeks. We've got all of these bills out there where they're called, calling voter suppression, but of course the side that's proposing them is calling it voting security, and the other side's calling it voter suppression. And so, I mean, but that's just partisanship, I think, really.
Yeah,
I mean,
but we've never had it. It doesn't feel to this degree. I mean, the challenge is, I think, that there's a history of voter suppression towards certain groups in this country, obviously, that can't be denied, nor shouldn't. And we have in recent elections had some foreign interference and some other things. So there are election security issues. But I don't think it's good for the health of the democracy to have half the country thinking the vote is being suppressed and half the country thinking the vote is being stolen, for something that really can be addressed in a more technical manner. So it is. I mean, of course, it's partisanship, but it's now reaching the point where it's affecting the health of the country. And I think there's a very important interest to figure out how to get this right in a way that people can believe and have trust, in the process, regardless of which side they may be on.
Well, for example, I mean, one issue that I think is a little contentious is something like same-day registration. You know, which we for years we didn't have this. I think we have it now in Connecticut. I'm not absolutely sure, but I think we do. And we didn't have it for many years. Connecticut is known as the land of steady habits. So like we're going to be the last state to legalize marijuana. I promise. You know, so, but we, it actually struck me as being, God, you know, that's kind of hard to do. I mean, don't those ballots have to be provisional until you actually manage to verify that this person is, you know, lives where he says he does and that kind of thing? Or do you have that capability at every single voting site? That kind of sounds expensive. And it made me think about maybe a more philosophical division out there that I don't know if it's this is getting a little off topic because it's not related directly to mechanics, but you know, it's been suggested. One of Alice's friends made a list of suggestions about things that we should do to have a robust voting system, and in there he suggested that, you know, voters actually do have a duty to be responsible, and you know, sort of making it sound like, well, look, in order to be a responsible citizen, you have to do a little planning ahead. So go register. How hard is it to go register? You know, and of course the answer might be, well, it might be very hard for somebody to go register, especially certain people. If you, I mean, then it kind of descends into anecdotes. But I mean, what about someone who really can't get around? You know, what do you do for people like that? People who either are disabled and can't get around, or people who just have no means of getting around to the place where you want them to register. How many places are you going to have for them to register? So these are, you know, there's kind of a tension between wanting to have universal, you know, genuinely universal suffrage, and on the other hand, wanting to have suffrage that's really requires this sense of duty and citizenship and responsibility that you have to, you know, participate in. It takes a little more effort than just showing up and voting. But maybe that's off topic.
No, I mean, I think it's a question of, you know, like I said, I think that the voter has to initiate the process on some level to avoid disorganization, and also just as a basic, you know, civic responsibility at the same time. We don't, you know, and this is where some of the opposition to some voting restrictions has been, is you don't want to create barriers to voting at the same time. But even in states that, for example, have you know, required voter ID laws, some of these states have also said, like, look, if you need transportation to get this done, or you need some accommodation to get this done, we will provide it. And I think when this occurred in South Carolina, and that was, you know, I think it was 25 people a year were taking advantage of this, you know, government accommodation. It was really an immaterial amount of people. That doesn't mean we should not have it, but it makes you wonder how significant of a barrier it is. And I say that not supporting things that would create a significant barrier. But I don't know in practice how significant of a barrier it actually is in terms of access and mobility, or if it's just, you know, it's just convenience. I mean, I think, and that's not to defend or endorse any recent or prior law in any way. That's just, you know, thinking through the mechanics of those questions.
So do we? I mean, just to the group, do you think? I mean, is there real merit in universal suffrage? Is this like what, a noble goal, or
I think it's a different question. What is,
okay? But this question I'm asking,
yeah, which, you know, like what is, it becomes a what is universal suffrage thing mean? So, like, my view. Again, a different subtopic within the election conversation is like, and this is my most you know, I don't have many leftist views. This is probably my one. So it'll come out very, it'll sound very left wing, but that's okay. Is that in my own view, I do believe people who are incarcerated should be able to vote. Perhaps it's a libertarian streak, perhaps it's incarcerated relatives that I've, you know, known in the past. I just feel like, you know, you still should participate, have the access to participate in the democracy, because the laws are still affecting you. And I don't think that that needs to be part of the punishment. At the same time, I know that the 13th Amendment allows that, and I respect that. But that would be my one thing. So like, I'm from that standpoint, I'm very much of the view that we should be making voting as accessible as possible. So that gives you an extent of how extreme I feel on that.
There wouldn't be any question about their residency.
That's right. Well, no, but then the argument would be: do they reside in the jail, or do they reside at where they were before they went to jail? Although my view is that they might be the most informed citizens because they have time to sit and read the newspaper all day, and then what would happen is there'd just be all these campaign mailers flooding the prisons. It would be very interesting.
That's pretty good. Well, I'm glad we were able to bring out your inner leftist.
Yeah, that doesn't happen very often, so I saved it for here.
Mission accomplished.
But no, you know, we should all think independently about issues, right? So,
well, there's some states that still don't allow convicted felons.
Well, you know, we had an interesting thing happen. Sorry, go ahead.
There were ex-convicts that are out. There's still states, I know in New York, at years ago, if you were a convicted felon, even if you served your time, sentenced, did your time, and released, you could not vote for life. You were banned from voting.
Still like that in Iowa, for example.
That's been changed in most places, but I don't know if all states have changed.
Not all states yet. Like
I
Iowa.
can tell you in Florida, I was still there when this happened. There was a.
That's right.
It was a constitutional amendment question on the ballot, and it passed that to allow felons who had served their sentences to vote upon completion of their sentence. Right. And then it got real controversial because the legislature and governor wanted to limit that to ex-felons who had actually completed all of the terms of their sentencing, not just any incarceration, but also any restitution. Sorry, any restitution that was ordered. You know, so they had to complete all of those terms, which came as a big surprise to the people who had been promoting the constitutional amendment. And it actually passed by something like 62, 63%. It was overwhelmingly popular, but so, you know, that turned into something more controversial than I think people thought it should have been. And I guess it's still the case that there are many ex-convicts who can't vote in Florida because they haven't made that kind of restitution because they don't have the money. So that's interesting. You know, one of the things that came up with in this last year, I mean, we talked about this. I think Sean Campbell, you brought this up, that you had ballots being sent out, or I don't know if they were absentee ballots or absentee applications. I think there's certainly a difference there. But it was done last year. It was done also in Connecticut, because normally in Connecticut, you have to have a reason to vote absentee. We don't have vote by mail at all. We still don't have vote by mail. You can vote absentee if you're over 65. That is a reason to get an absentee ballot. That's one. But this last year, that was opened up so that anyone could vote absentee. But then, you know, we don't talk a lot about, at least we don't hear a lot of talk. I don't hear a lot of talk in the press about how, you know, 2020 was really special because of the pandemic. And, you know, we probably did a lot of things that we wouldn't really think about doing in any normal election cycle. So a lot of the things that turned around and became controversial, you know, I have to wonder to what extent they became controversial just because they were different. They were different for a good reason, but it turned into, in some cases, people just raising that as an issue. Well, oh, you can't do that because it makes it a less reliable election. And you know, in a lot of cases, that was centered around the voting by mail process, and which in most states, not in every state, but in most states, was really just a relaxation of the absentee ballot qualification rules, where it was handled exactly like absentee voting was handled, you know, in elections past. So I wonder if anybody has any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Like you said, 2020 was an abnormal year, obviously, and a lot of things, a lot of normal rules that were in place before were relaxed for obvious reasons, for public health reasons mostly. But when they did that, they also ended up resulting in the closing of over 21,000 polling sites around the country. So with less polling sites, you force people to use mail-in ballots. So that's why the astronomical increase in mail-in and absentee ballots. And then, like Rob said, people pointed to that abnormality as something that to bring into question the integrity of the election, which was really unfounded, as like in my mind anyhow, and in the mind of 60 other judges around the country where they're challenged, and it was proven to be legitimate. Now, in every election, there's going to be some percentage of fraud, or whether it's intentional or unintentional, in errors and mistakes and things, human error. The problem is with paper ballots, or anytime you have human intervention in this process, you're going to have errors. It's just the way it is. You know, I can give you each of us can get 1,000 pieces of paper to count, and you could have 999, I'll have 1,000, you'll have 1,001, and we'll try and count them, and we'll hand them out, and we'll try and verify. I guarantee you, each of us will count these things, and they'll come out with different counts. It's just human nature. You just make, people make mistakes. And there has to be an acceptable margin of error process. You have to understand that 2 to 3% of these ballots are going to be off, that the counts are going to. And once you see that abnormality go above that acceptable margin of error, then you have to start looking at it more closely. And that's when you get into recounts and all of these other things. As far as the closing of 21,000 polling sites, that people point to that as voter suppression. Well, it wasn't voter suppression because it was supplemented by the increase in mail-in ballots that were provided to the voting, the eligible voters.
Yeah.
People on, depending on which side of the spectrum you're on, will look at that. You can look at it either way. But the truth of the matter is, when you boil it down, it really wasn't. The problem was when, as Rob mentioned before, about people needing to go or didn't get a mail-in ballot or an absentee ballot and wanted to go and vote in person because that's the way they prefer to vote. And they're living in a depressed area or a socio-economical area in the country where they don't have access to a car and they don't have access to public transportation. And the polling site that used to be a couple blocks away is now 10 miles away. That person can't get there.
Yeah.
So what does that person do? Now they might get a ride from some neighbor or a friend that might be willing to take them and give them a ride and take them down the road. Some states in the recent legislation that's being put around in Texas and Florida and Georgia and these states that are coming out with these new laws are actually limiting the number of people that you can carry in your car to a polling site and questioning how many passengers you can bring. I mean, that's the kind of thing that goes over the top in my estimation. What, you know, the government should not care how many people. If I have 4 people in the car or 6 people in the car, it doesn't matter. I'm getting them there to vote. And if I bring in a bus, what does it matter? If as long as they're eligible voters, they should be allowed to go into that polling site. But they're trying to put in these barriers to prevent people from
Yeah.
transporting passengers into the polling site and cast a legitimate vote. And that's that's an issue in my mind. And the fact that it's in a law and it's going through and it's being passed by these legislatures is a problem to me. And I think something has to be done because it's in 30-something states. These types of things, not that
Yeah.
particular issue, but these types of issues that are being built into this recent wave of legislation is a problem. And it's undermining the process. And as Sean said, it's undermining democracy overall. And I think, I don't know what can be done. I guess these laws have to be challenged and eventually go to the Supreme Court. But then that, we had the Voting Rights Act in 1965 to try and resolve some of these issues that were going on.
Mm.
Suppression, obvious voter suppression was going on prior to that. And then, the federal government tried to step in, and then they had guidelines in there for the federal government to have oversight over state changes in the laws to make sure that these types of abuses didn't take place. And then what happened in 2013, the Shelby decision, and that wiped all that out. And now it's free reign again, and these states are taking full advantage. And I don't know, I guess these laws are gonna have to be challenged one by one and eventually go to the Supreme Court again. And, hopefully get back to some kind of oversight over these states to rein them in a little bit. There has to be some changes.
Sean, Sean Campbell, you have anything you want to say about
Yeah,
that?
I mean, I think I agree with most of that. I mean, I think 2020 was just a perfect storm of understandable changes due to a public health emergency, and trying some new things, and just having leadership that just fundamentally was unwilling to turn down the temperature at any point and kept riling things up. So that unfortunately gets a lot of other people riled up, and we know how that ended and is seeming to continue in some ways. The Shelby County case, having read the case, that was always actually something where I generally tended to disagree with here I go again. I disagree with the conservative majority on that.
I can't believe how well this is working out.
I actually think that was one of Ginsburg's best dissents, because what she does is she actually provides a factual driven analysis of just how many of these types of voting bills had to go through the pre-clearance process and were ultimately rejected between the period of, let's say, I forget, like 1982 and 2011 or so. And to make the point that we maybe weren't past the need for what occurred in what the 1965 legislation is responding to. And again, I think Section 2 of the 15th Amendment says that Congress can regulate in this space, and Congress voted to authorize the Voting Rights Act 99-0 in the Senate in 2006, and George W. Bush signed it into law. So now, again, Congress can go back and sort of fill the vacuum that was left by the Shelby County decision. So that's always been my view. And I think in the last 10 years, there have definitely been a few examples of cases where voting restrictions were harnessed in a way that was not just to serve the political thicket, but even in a way that was, racially motivated, knowing how certain groups may vote. That being said, I don't think that every voter ID law out there is intended to be racially discriminatory, and I think that we do need to explore the nuance and look at every situation uniquely. I think that data has shown more recently, now that we've had 10 years of these voter ID laws out, that the voter ID laws don't deter racial minorities from voting, nor do they provide election security at the same time. So they're probably not achieving either of their perceived goals or flaws. And at this point in time, my view is more of again, for the health of the democracy, we have half the country that thinks that we're suppressing the vote, and half the country thinks we're stealing the vote. And so it more becomes a thing of like, how do we address that question? And if we have to do some voter ID to appease the public a little bit in certain areas, it's something that at this point I'm open to. I do think they're having not read every word of like the Georgia bill. I have not read every word of it, but you know, I agree that there were some excesses. I also think, however, that some of, you know, calling some of these things a threat to democracy, we're talking about drop-in boxes that didn't exist 2 years ago. Like for all our country's history, we didn't have drop boxes. I don't personally have a problem with the drop boxes, but you know, they're very new. People are uncomfortable with them, and I think having a little discussion about what they mean and maybe what the right balance is and what hours they should be open or whatnot. You know, I don't have all the answers to those things, but I don't think that discussing those things is a threat to democracy, nor am I saying anybody here is calling him a threat to democracy. I'm just saying that's what I hear on the news a lot. So that's actually what I'm responding to when I you know, give my feedback on some of the recent legislation. So again, I think yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of room for looking at some of the nuance here.
Well, you know, the People's Republic of Connecticut here actually provides some support for your argument, because we don't have any of this stuff. I mean, we did have drop boxes for the mail-in ballots only in 2020, and again, it was just the part of the problem there was all of the mistrust that had been ginned up towards the postal service with the, you know, the stuff that
not
was
healthy for a democracy,
which could not have been less timely. You know, whatever the arguments were for changing whatever it was they wanted to do there, I'd have to say that I think last year was probably the worst possible time to be doing those kinds of things. Just in practical terms, you know, that all it was going to do was cause controversy. And you know, generally speaking, I think that in years past, the post office has done a great job in handling ballots. They know how to handle ballots, and you know, that only really came into question because of all of the upheaval that was caused there. So some of that was caused by those actions by the post office. You probably wouldn't have had drop boxes in Connecticut at all if that whole issue hadn't come along. And as I said, that was the first election where we ever had them at all. So you know, I have to be a little circumspect in arguing that, oh, you know, what Georgia is doing is voter suppression when they're limiting things that we don't have here, period. So now, you know, it's the old, well, try to take away a right, you know, or a privilege that somebody has been granted. It's a whole different thing than just never having had it.
Yeah, but we do have to be careful about the stepping back. And anytime, if we've expanded voter accessibility, but then we start to step it back, then you're by definition suppressing some portion of the vote, even if it's right now used in only a small amount of cases. It's in some cases. So it's a really and it happens in all sorts of states. You know, not even ones which were covered under the portion of the voting rights bill that was repealed in 2013.
You know, so, I never understood when that decision came out. My reaction was, you know, as I recall, the decision was basically that there's no real justification for treating these states differently now. That you know, that we think that should, generally speaking, not be done. And I thought, well, okay, just make all the states pre-clear. You won't have it, you know, the ones that haven't ever been up to this stuff, they are going to sail right through. They're not going to add that much of a burden to the Department of Justice to say, oh yeah, okay, this is whatever, Idaho, they've never been a problem, forget it. And I don't even know if Idaho ever has been a problem. So, but, and they still haven't done that with the current act, the one that's before the Congress now, I guess is it the John Lewis Act, that they're still targeting, specific states. What are they thinking? Because that kind of just completely pulls the rug out from under the Shelby case, as far as I can see, anyway. But, so one thing that I'm wondering about, an interesting thing about the Florida system that I really liked, which we never had here, and which actually I thought made it fairly robust, was that part of their system was that when they sent me a mail-in ballot, I could log into their website and look at my data, my record in their system, and it said, yeah, we mailed your ballot on such and such a date. And if I didn't receive it, I could call them up, I could go there, I could do something about it. Likewise, when I returned it, a line item would show up saying, we received your ballot. And if there were problems, I would actually get a notification. I'd get a postcard or something, but it would also show up on their website. So they had the history of my mail-in ballot was right there on the website. And including a feature that I thought was really almost gracious, was that you made a mistake, come in and see us, that we're not, your ballot didn't go through the machine or whatever it was. I don't think it actually detailed what the problem was, but that there was something wrong with your ballot. So like an overvote or something like that, where you vote for both Trump and Biden, that's an overvote. You can't, the machine won't accept that. And that kind of thing was really useful to me, and it would also prevent someone else from voting in my name, right? Because if no one else could use my registration to vote without me knowing it, because it's kind of like people who steal your identity and file your tax return. You find out, it's like, wait, you already filed your tax return. You'll get a message back from the IRS. And so, I think the use of those kinds of systems could be really helpful. Likewise, in both Florida and in Connecticut, the voter rolls themselves are public information. And so you can look and see who's registered to vote. So if you think there are a bunch of people who don't exist who are registered to vote, you can go look them up. It's not, if that information is presented in a way that you can, get at it easily, it's sort of easy in Florida. It's not at all easy in Connecticut. That kind of thing could, I think, bolster confidence, which is, as I've said a few times in our messages around, that's what I really want to know is, what changes do we make to give people the confidence that we think has become eroded in our elections. So what do you think about those kinds of things? I mean, if you could look at the voter rolls, see who's registered to vote, and in fact, it's also public information what party they're registered with, if that's done in it is done in Connecticut. It was not done in, say, North Carolina, where I lived for a while. It is done in Florida, but not in Texas. So 50% of the states went one way and 50% the other that I've lived in, as far as registering, as with a party. But making that kind of information available, I would think, could go a long way towards, minimizing the degree to which somebody can claim that, oh yeah, a whole bunch of people voted who shouldn't have voted. Well, who? Gives us a way to answer that question.
Well, as long as the inability to get, because you can imagine there are whole bunches of people who wouldn't be able to regularly check up on their their profile as you did. And if not checking into that profile somehow can be used to disqualify you, that wouldn't be a good thing. If it's strictly just a check, so a little bit more casual, I guess, then I don't see the harm in it. But I can see people saying, well, this person hasn't logged in 27 months. They must not be, and yet, they'll have a vote. But
maybe they're dead.
Yeah, or maybe they just don't log in, but they go and they vote. And they say, wait a second, the person didn't log in, but they did vote. Don't they have any interest in seeing their registration? And you can imagine a whole kerfuffle. Just why? Because people like to make kerfuffles.
Well, of course, a lot of it can be and is done in a push method as opposed to a pull method. In other words, you get a notification. So, and again, Connecticut doesn't do this. It doesn't send you an email saying thank you for voting, but they could, and as could any state. And as Sean Doherty was saying earlier, we have all of this technology, and yet we still struggle with so many of these things that could at least, if not be exactly solved or resolved by the use of that technology, that at least the suspected existence of issues could be minimized. One of the things that I thought of back during the Florida issues back in 2000, because you had that. Remember, those were the days of the hanging chad, where they were using basically a kind of punch card voting system where you had to stick a metal thing through a template to punch a hole in a card. And they also had the format of those things was so confusing. They had something called a butterfly ballot, where you ended up, I think the news story at the time was that you had a community that was mostly old, retired Jewish people voting for Pat Buchanan. And that just made no sense. And so they were pretty convinced that they just, and if you looked at the way the ballot was laid out, said, oh yeah, I can see how I could make that mistake. And so I was thinking, we talk about wanting to use paper ballots. And I think, as Sean already mentioned earlier, the least accurate count to me, it seems, is likely to be a hand count. We get these hand recounts after an original machine count, and they're a little bit off, and we think, okay, well, the machine wasn't that far off, and I'm thinking, well, okay, the hand count wasn't that far off. The machine count's probably the one that was more likely to be correct. But as far as just the way the ballot's presented, that it's not hard to imagine a system wherein you have a presentation of each race, on a computer screen, that somebody can say, oh yeah, that's the person I want to vote for, and they just use a touch screen, right? And at the end of that process, you put a list up on the screen that says, okay, here's who you voted for this race, it's this guy, and so on. And you have this list, and the voter can look at that and say, yeah, okay, all that's correct, or they can go back and make corrections, or it's correct, bing, press a button, and they're gone. I thought that would be a really sensible way to actually cast a vote. Now, the disadvantage is it's electronic, right? And people, rightly to some extent, are suspicious of electronics. How do I know where it went? It actually showed up on a Facebook post not too long ago. Someone is in one of these discussion groups of Alice's, where someone was distressed that after he cast his ballot, and I think it was an absentee ballot that he cast, that he no longer could look at it. And I thought, well, you could never look at your ballot after you cast it, right? That's the way it always worked, right? You put your handwritten ballot into a ballot box, you're not going to know which one's yours after that. Mm-hmm. But I actually thought, wouldn't it be cool if you could? And I think one of Alice's friends also had suggested that getting a printed receipt with who you voted for would actually be a really cool thing. So, you know, if the front end of the voting were electronic, but then you get this printed receipt that tells you, here's your receipt, here's what you bought, you know, here's who you voted for. and it led me to think of one more thing, that what if you had a private ID number assigned by the system associated with that set of votes? You could actually publish those, right? Because the only person who has that ID number would be the system and that printed receipt that you had. So that you could go back and after an election, let's say that you posted for every precinct, you'd post, you know, here's all these private IDs and here's who they voted for, right? And you could add them up. Anybody could add them up. Anybody wants to do a recount, go do a recount. It would actually take advantage of crowdsourcing, that you would have countless nerds doing this and verifying that the votes actually add up. Now, it occurred to me later that you know, you could also just do that online. It would be something if, you know, I can look up on my record in Florida and see that I voted, but it doesn't show me who I voted for. Because in part, it's not, maybe it's not that secure, because all of that information is, at this point, it's public information. That I voted and is also part of the public record. Obviously, who I voted for isn't, but wouldn't that be pretty cool if you had a system like that would be kind of self-checking in a way? Well, it's not exactly self-checking, but it's crowd-checked. It could be crowd-checked.
Yeah, I'm not always convinced about the wisdom of the crowd. I'm sorry. There's too many competing. You could be this crowd and this crowd, and then they're each doing their separate check, and they're each waiting for a different thing. Yeah, it starts to take it out of. Yeah, I get a little bit nervous about that. That suddenly the check becomes, well, even more political than it is now.
Well, they're just numbers, you know, they're just numbers in a list. And so, yeah, people could take that and add it up wrong, but there's only going to be one official list. I could sort of imagine it being, you know, printed and published at the town hall kind of thing, as well as being available in an Excel file, you know, that you could, everybody can get the official Excel file. You put a checksum on it so you know if it's been modified. I mean, things like that. So it's not like somebody could falsify that without it being detectable. And of course, it would disagree with everybody else's Excel file. So, I mean, I think you're kind of right in being suspicious about that sort of thing, that you probably would have people who would take that information and try to fiddle with it and make, oh, look what happened here, you know.
Yeah, okay.
It couldn't work, right? And of course, you can make that kind of thing illegal because that would be wasting everybody's time. That you wouldn't want people to, that would really be a kind of fraud itself, right? Manipulating that data, which again, it's just your copy of the data. It's not anything, the original data. But would that sort of thing increase just the confidence in elections? That how would someone come along and say, you know, oh, votes were switched? Well, everybody, if somebody comes along and says votes were switched, then everybody would be going to their record on the website and saying, no, my vote wasn't switched. Here's my paper. Here's, you know. Now somebody might make a mistake and say, oh yeah, I did make a mistake, but that's a different story. But yeah, it kind of creates a sort of feedback loop, you know, that you can actually look at what happened in retrospect at that, you know, much finer level of detail. And I guess I was trying to think of something that would be inarguable,
mean, I like the value placed on more transparency and creating the feedback loop. You know, I have concerns about the security and privacy of the ID number, that even though it's still anonymous when made public, you know, you wonder how long it's going to stay anonymous if all you then have to do is find some way of connecting the number back to the individual, and then you know, there's a security issue there. I like the receipt. I think the receipt is interesting.
Well, yeah.
Although
agree
I
with you.
wonder, I mean, so the receipt would be more in response to it's like, you know, you look at it when you're done and you're like, wait, that's not what I paid for. And then you have, I don't know, 6 hours to exchange it for a different candidate. Like, you know, what is the, other than being a memento for posterity, like, you know, is the receipt is to ensure that the people clicked on the correct button, or, you know, punched the right hole, or and can have some verification afterwards, and have some way within, I don't know, 4 hours or something of making an exchange. Again,
Well, I wasn't thinking so
voters
much.
on election day.
I wasn't thinking so much about that. Because in my scheme, the idea was that the system would show you your selections before you hit, in effect, submit. You know, the
Right,
button we're
right,
using.
okay.
Okay, so you would have had one chance to do it there.
Okay.
And this kind of goes back to something we were talking about earlier. I mean, you know, to what extent do you want to indulge people? And honestly, I don't know the answer to that.
I mean,
So, I mean, if you want to let people, you know, gosh, take the thing home, and oh, wait a minute, I did the wrong thing, come back in. That if that receipt could actually be re-entered into the system, you know, you make a receipt that could itself be scanned so that you could actually change that vote.
I mean, I guess it ultimately comes down to, you know, how material of a difference does it make in elections? How many people care about it, and will it increase the trust we have in democracy? And at the end of the day, as much as I like the idea, in a sense, I do wonder if it would have any material effect on achieving those goals. I think that would have to be the
Go ahead.
analysis.
Other Sean?
Yeah, I don't like the idea of people having the opportunity to come in and change their votes after they've been cast.
Yeah, that gets complicated now that I'm thinking about it.
You know, especially if you have early voting, now you have a 30-day window. I know a lot of indecisive people. They change their mind every other hour, you know. Oh, wait, that's not what I meant, and that's not what I want to do. And they'd be back in every other day saying, wait a minute, I can't. And then I spoke to somebody else influenced their, you know, they went to church and the pastor said this, they want to change it again. I just don't like the idea. Once you test it, you're done. You know, you get an opportunity to look at it, review it, confirm it, and submit it. And then once you're done, you're done. You're not coming back with it.
I agree.
Yeah, I'm actually inclined to agree with that myself. That, you know, the idea of changing wasn't so much anything I had in mind. Yeah, and of course, if you're using, I mean, that kind of thing, having a receipt could actually work with the systems that not exactly the systems we have now, but the kind of ballots that we use now. You know, these paper ballots that you fill in circles and put them through a machine. Well, the machine could give you back a receipt. It could have that private ID number. I certainly, I agree that there are obvious security questions there, and that you don't want it to be possible for that ID number to actually be in any way associated with an individual voter. That and you know, you could construct a system where it's simply not. You know, that there is simply no connection between the individual and that private ID. But I agree with the concern that has to be done extremely carefully. Otherwise, it basically kind of defeats the secret ballot part of the whole thing. Not that a secret ballot has always been part of our voting history, but it's something that we seem to be fond of. So.
Well, a mail-in ballot today, I would think, I never used one, but I would think there's some kind of a barcode to verify that's a valid ballot, right? When it gets sent in, it's got to be scanned to verify that it's legit, right? You can't just.
Yeah, they actually
Paper
had,
ballot
as I
mailed in.
recall, and I wish I obviously don't have one around because I sent them back in. As I recall, they had a couple of layers of, you have the outer mailing envelope, you have an inner envelope that you have to sign, and you sign across the seal in Florida. So it would be really difficult to, tamper with it. And as I recall, there's a barcode on both the inner envelope and the ballot that those match up, so that they do have some, some security features. But you mentioned early voting. What do you guys think about early voting? Do you have any problems with early voting?
Oh, I prefer to have it open as long as possible, 90 days if possible. Simply because the earlier somebody can go in and vote, it reduces the length of the lines, no waiting period. Especially if you're going with fewer polling sites around the country, then you open it up as early as possible.
Yep.
Other Sean?
I think, yeah, I would support it to a degree. My concern is that, from the perspective of how we think of a traditional, campaign season, if it's like if the election's in November and people can start voting in August, it's almost like the election season just gets moved up, like, almost what becomes from the people who are running for office, like what's the point of campaigning from August through November if like when is this election happening? Like it almost gets confusing when I think it's that wide a length of time. Although again, as I said earlier, I do have an interest in wanting to make voting accessible, and obviously early voting is a way to achieve that. So I think it's just about trying to find the balance there so that it isn't just any time available. So that way there's like some structure to it. Like, all right, you're gonna have this time to hear the candidates' ideas, because like if in New Jersey the primary season is in June and then the general election is in November. So if it's a primary, are they voting up to 90 days ahead of time in the primary? And then if the primary is in June and then people are starting to vote in the general election in August, have they had, I mean, look, a lot of people already know who they're going to vote for, and they're not really swing voters, and they don't really need to hear the platform, and they could go on the website and read. Maybe that's just an issue the politicians have to deal with in restructuring how they campaign, and maybe it's the burdens on them to think about, and it's not on the voter to worry about. Maybe 90 days is okay in that case, and the politicians can figure it out. I don't know. I just think it's those are my those are I think the things to weigh.
How about you, Ben?
Yes, no, I think early voting's been a good thing. I don't know the length in most states, but I don't think it's excessive. I maybe I'm totally ignorant, but I don't think it's numbers of months. It's numbers of weeks. But again, yes, we didn't have it in New York till very, very recently. But now that it's here, it should stay here. I guess there was a case in Ohio where it had been X number of weeks and then it became X-1 or X-2 weeks. And that is one of those decreases in voter. So so it's yes. Is it more chance to vote than it was in New York in 2013 or 14? Yes, because we didn't have early voting. But still, if the law there said you could have 5 weeks of early voting, say, and then becomes 4, then you're pulling away and you're making it harder for people to vote. And that's even if compared to a state that doesn't have, okay. maybe New York was doing it wrong for all those years, and we finally got some early voting.
Well, I agree. I think with what Sean said, I do think it's a balance of, I mean, I don't know how early is too early. We had early voting in Florida. I was voting by mail, so it didn't make a whole lot of difference to me. But it did. I think I might have done it once, and it seemed very convenient. And okay, it was great. I mean, I didn't see any negatives to it, other than the theoretical ones, like, well, what if I vote for somebody and then change my mind about him or her? And okay, that's the risk you take, I guess, if you vote early. But I think I agree that it's more a problem for the politicians than anything else. And of course, it is, God knows it's true that our campaign seasons start unmercifully early, that we have these almost constant campaigns in this country. And I have, having worked for a very small but very global company, I had a lot of friends in a lot of countries, and they just all thought it was insane that when they'd hear about the way we do campaigns in the United States. In France, I think they've got something like 30 days or something where they can campaign. And once they have early voting, and once they start voting, there's no more campaigning. So, but it's only maybe voting is a week or two. So in the week or two before the election, there's no campaigning. So there are people out there doing it a totally different way than we do it. Not that has a
it would be nice for those things to be limited, of course. And then I'd have to take an opposition to Citizens United. And
well, we'd be on the same side again.
Well, it's a challenge of like I understand where the majority is coming from a First Amendment perspective, but I really don't like the policy outcome, and I really wish we had a constitutional amendment to go back to how it was, because there's something just that feels immoral about, I don't know, $200-something million being spent on an Iowa Senate race, when it's like you're spending literally $100 a person to campaign in terms of the eligible voters in the state of Iowa. And that can't be healthy either. So, I think I don't know, going back to the old paradigm, I can't imagine anyone who likes the policy outcome. The lobbyists have so much more work to do and so much more pressure, I'm sure. The people have to raise more money. The people have, I mean, it's just just feels like way too much speech. Not that I would get any joy out of restricting speech, but I think we were fine for the, prior 100 years, how things were going.
Interesting. Anyone else have any comments about that?
What if you expanded the terms instead of a 4-year term to a 6-year term? At least you might get a little break between campaigns.
I don't know. The campaign, they might just expand to fill available space. It's one of those things. Yeah, I guess my feeling about that is that the whole purpose of allowing free speech is to allow for ideas to be aired freely. And when you turn money into speech, you really end up squelching speech. It gets drowned out. All you hear is the guy with the most money, or the guys with the most money. And so that's not really accomplishing the underlying purpose, so that everyone's ideas can be expressed freely.
I mean, I don't know. I feel like I don't think that that's the case necessarily in current times, where something can so easily go viral, or we still have successful grassroots campaigns, and it's not like Bernie Sanders was like the most well-funded candidate in the world, but his message really took a following, and so I think there's when you think about the utility of every dollar that's spent, right, the way that it's deployed and the message behind it and the marketing techniques that are used, a dollar can look very different in its there's a lot of earned media that could be embedded in how that dollar is spent. And I don't necessarily think that the money automatically correlates to speech. Certainly it does often enough, but I don't think that's always the case.
Well, I bet that you have a lot better picture of where Rupert Murdoch stands on a whole lot of issues than you do where I stand on a whole lot of issues.
Well, how so? I mean, feel free to.
Rupert Murdoch?
Yeah,
well,
familiar.
Okay, so he owns Fox News, and Fox News says what Rupert thinks, I think, an awful lot of the time, and so that means that And look,
so you're taking it more out of the Citizens United context, because that would be more. That's just a general media,
Well, that's true, and you're right. As far as that goes, maybe I should have said Sheldon Adelson. There you go. No, of course, he's dead now. But guys who drop so much money on candidates that they actually can turn candidates into just people into candidates. There have been cases where, what was it? The last time Newt Gingrich ran for president, he would not have been there at all, but for Sheldon Adelson. And so that's that kind of thing is.
I just don't,
undesirable.
I mean, that's the thing. It's not producing favorable outcomes. Again, I don't have any right to tell anybody what to do in this regard, but I just think, $200 million on an Iowa U.S. Senate race or a New Hampshire Senate race, a limited government person like me believes that if you're going to have limited government, then the community has to step up, and you have to do private philanthropy, and you have to invest in your community, and you have to be connected. And if you want, if I have all that money and a limited government view, I'd rather take $200 million and actually, honestly, I could. This will sound like a bribe, and I don't mean it that way, but I might be better off just giving the money. It'd be more efficient to just pay the people to vote the way I want them to vote at that point. I mean, you can literally just buy the election. Now, I don't encourage that. That's a whole different election law issue. But there's something to be said about like real tangible issues in that community where you're spending $200 million could be addressed. Not that money solves problems in communities either. I mean, there's the challenges of our times are more complex than just money, but money contributes, and like I just if I'm a government billionaire, I'd rather invest my money in building the community. But that's just me, and that's probably off topic.
No. It's
really bad incentives we've created with just the amount of spending.
It looks suspicious, doesn't it? It starts to look like a plutocracy, right? I mean, just at the very least, superficially, it starts to look like plutocracy.
And then the other thing that I think about, which frustrates me about politics, and this ties into election spending, is when you think about whether it's a state legislature or Congress, just the amount of power that is concentrated in legislative leaders. They really do control all the strings, and that's why I think it was Justin Amash a few weeks ago, I think referred to it as an oligarchy almost, in the sense that it is very hard to have an independent streak over this stuff when it's structured the way it is, and I don't necessarily know if you can structure it different or better, but I think you just see the faults of human nature emerge in the systems that we have, and it's the human nature that has to be addressed even before the systems can be changed.
So I thought that one of my checking the time here. One of my jobs here was to kind of constrain the discussion and keep it going in a certain direction. But since you went there,
Sorry, I went to a place I wasn't supposed
No,
to.
I mean, I'm finding it almost hilarious that you went there, because that's always been one of my hot button issues was, you know, as I learned about this, I bemoaned the fact that the first thing that our state legislatures and our Congress people do when they go to Washington, having been endowed by us with the power of the state, is turn it over to people we don't know. They turn it over to the leadership. And, you know, there's this sort of second order politic going on there that we just have zero visibility to. You know, how do you end up with with the people that we've ended up with, just, you know, presently and historically, that and I think actually that's a tremendous source of alienation from politics generally, is that we see ourselves. I mean, the people you see on the news in the afternoon, aside from the president, you know, you'll see Mitch McConnell or Nancy Pelosi, and of course half the country is looking at each of those people saying, how did we get them? You know, and I don't. There's no good answer to that question.
Oh, and my view of them is like they do the same thing, and they serve the same role for their respective side.
Sure.
You know, it's
sure, but they weren't. We didn't get to vote.
It's a very political job, and
yeah,
you know, you realize then the difference between politics and policy, where politics is about the organization of moving something forward, and policy is about, you know, the ideas and the merits and drawbacks of particular ideas that are going to affect lives. But politics is really about the organizational dynamics to, I guess, move policy forward. Those are two very different things. But then in our country, obviously, or in any system, not our country, but like in any system, they go hand in hand.
Yeah, well, I understand. I was just amused to hear you raise that issue, because so few people do. You know, it's not an issue that I hear a lot of people raising, and it's one of my favorites, because I've often wondered if it wouldn't be a really good idea to actually allow the American people to elect congressional leadership, because they exercise so much control over policy that in some ways they're pretty much on a par with the president in terms of their sort of gatekeeping role with regard to policy. So anyway, that does venture kind of far afield from the mechanics of voting, but you know, we've talked about a lot of the things on our on the outline that I had made, and you know, it's maybe a little surprising that I sense that there's a fair degree of agreement about a lot of these things, at least no tremendous hostility towards anything that anyone has said. Is that the case? You agree with that?
That's how I feel.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm curious. So far so good. We had, gosh, I'm down to, you know, electronic systems versus paper ballot. You know, we talked a little bit about paper ballots, and I think, you know, using electronic systems, we know there's some suspicions that you're probably right to have about them. That is, they do have to be robust. They have to be robustly constructed. You know, it occurred to me, I know in at least one voting district, I think it was, there was a big issue where a ballot counting device had not been programmed for the election that was underway. And so a bunch of votes, a lot of votes, were miscounted. And it was really obvious, because I think this was a Republican leaning county, and the votes just were totally wrong, you know. And so they looked at it, realized that the machine was improperly programmed, loaded the correct software into it, and counted the ballots again. And later, when there was a hand count done, that it was, you know, within a dozen votes out of, I don't remember how many, well over 10,000 anyway. So do you guys have any want to say anything about the use of these systems? And I think Sean Doherty, you may have said something earlier about the hand counting, and I agreed with what you said. Was that I don't like hand counting. I think it's unlikely to be as good as the machines, as long as the machines are properly properly programmed.
In banks, they have money counters because they count accurately, and when people, with sticky fingers miscount bills, and it's just human error.
Yeah.
And I have faith in technology as long as it's properly programmed and certified. I think that's the way to go. I mean, in today's world, you think about security, they have iris scans, you have facial recognition, you have biometrics. All of this stuff is available to be utilized to make sure that everything is as accurate as possible. And I think that's the way to go. And removing as much as you can the human intervention makes it more accurate. And it makes it, I think it gives the system credibility and integrity, and that's what you need. My fear today is what we just went through in the last election, and the questions of integrity of our election process is going to repeat itself again in another 4 years. And every election after that. It's never happened in my lifetime that I can remember where we had this issue. And when the president in August of 2020 started laying the groundwork, my fear started then. Once he started talking about questioning the process, if he didn't win, that's when it started. And that's when my fear started. I said, if this doesn't go right, we're going to have a problem, and it's going to recur every 4 years. And so I think we need to come up with some way to restore faith in the system and ensure integrity. And I think you need to standardize certain things and maybe set some parameters respecting state sovereignty. We have an agency called the Federal Election Commission. I mean, I know they were established to kind of control campaign financing and that sort of thing, but why not expand their scope and give them some more authority and put a bipartisan commission in place to kind of lay out some federal standards to make things uniform to a degree, giving states some latitude, but make some kind of guidelines where the states have to do certain things. Things like you mentioned drop boxes. Now, mailing ballots are great, but if you reduce the number of drop boxes, mail-in ballots are useless because people have no place to put them if they don't trust the mail facility or the mail process, the U.S. Postal Service. So just as an example, the Federal Commission could come up with guidelines saying for every 100,000, some kind of proportionate system, for every 100,000 mail ballots you send out, you have to have X number of drop boxes. Something like that, and it gives them, and it sets a minimum. You must have at least this many drop boxes available for people. These are the kinds of things that I think people need to see in place to kind of restore their faith in the system. And I really hope something is done at some point before 2024, because I think we're going to go through this again. Regardless of who wins, it doesn't matter which side wins, whether it's the Democrat or Republican side, it's going to go back and forth. And every 4 years, we're going to go through this unless something drastic is done to change the way we've done things in the past.
Yeah.
Anyone? Yeah. I agree, Sean. I think the only thing I'm finding myself kind of recapitulating your argument from the very beginning, which is, what? We already have a post office. We ought to be able to have a postal service that can actually handle this stuff. We shouldn't need drop boxes on top of all of those mailboxes that we have, all around although I suppose we have fewer of those than we used to, but I certainly agree with the proposition that there ought to be an equal distribution of places you can submit your ballot. I just think we need to have a postal service that's reliable enough and robust enough to actually handle this stuff. And I can't imagine why we can't, other than, you know, in this case, I think it was really some partisan manipulation going on there, I think, but you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we've kind of undermined it for a long time. I guess that only recently changed. There was a change to the way the postal service has to fund its pension accounts, which was really, I think, overly rigorous for a number of years, where they were having to be funded out to 75 years or something like that, which made it really difficult for them to have enough money to actually do the job as well as they should be doing the job, given the revenue that they're taking in.
You know, Postal Service typically has that yearly holiday rush, and you know, postmen I know, I've done some filming with them, always get a charge. They're like, all right, bring it on. You know, I did the last rush. I'm going to do this one. This is going to, yeah, we're going to be tested to the limit, but we're going to make it. And it was just tougher to do, as you said, for partisan reasons and things. It seemed like there was some undercutting of the Postal Service, even more than usual this past year. So, yeah. But on the ground, the actual post delivery people, they're psyched to do it. They would love, they take pride in handling whatever ballots they do handle. They really take pride in that gets a bit of a higher priority. Any election materials, ballots and such, get a higher priority in the system. So they already have an infrastructure to work with regarding this sort of stuff.
Sean Campbell, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just to Sean's points, I share the same concern about 2024, concern that it's going to be worse. You know, and this was, you know, what we previously saw was completely avoidable, and was just, you know, reckless leadership or lack thereof. And, you know, I think the guidelines would be a non-controversial place to start, and yeah, I think there would be merit to that idea. And I think, you know, there's always even the, you know, carrot stick approach that could be taken, where, you know, for certain funding could be given to the states in exchange for compliance with some of those guidelines. You know, I think they're always, you know, even if there are certain things that maybe can't immediately be done because of constitutional questions, there are certainly other ways that you know, the federal government could play a role in doing what may be needed to, you know, increase the trust in these elections and then the health of the greater democracy. Because that's I mean, that's the most important thing in this, is we can't have what occurred. You know, we can't have that.
No.
And it's amazing how even after that occurred, how not everybody, but it seems like there's more than enough people that have just been willing to move on from it, like it never did.
You're speaking about.
I was concerned in August as well. I mean, I think you know, you could anticipate how that could play out poorly. Did not require any leap of imagination to see how that could go in a pandemic year, and where there was already so much division and unrest over a variety of things, and then you know, just again the perfect storm. Yeah, it's important that we get this right.
Of all of the things that I've heard that have been proposed in various states that tend to restrict or just reduce the opportunity for people to vote, that reduce the, if you want to call it convenience, you know, okay. But there's also apparently in a few states, and Georgia was one of them, where they are making it easier for agencies such as the Attorney General to have a greater influence over the management of elections than he's had in the past. And I suspect it's because the Secretary of State there was so adamant about doing his job, at least the way I saw it.
Mhm.
And what do you guys think about that kind of thing? I mean, the idea that you know, some state legislature may empower itself to actually take control of election. I think in Texas it's more judges that they're allowing, you know, judicial challenges to elections based on the possibility of fraud or something that seemed very very much a thin reed.
I think it's not dealing with the mechanics of solving the election security issues in the way that we're discussing them. I think the response and the reality is like, you know, although yeah, ultimately state legislatures certify the results in a, you know, presidential election, for example. And that's their constitutional right to do. I also think, you know, you have to take a step back with some of this stuff and say, like, you know, this wasn't a problem for the last, you know, 100 years, 200 years. Why is it a problem now? And why do we have to make drastic changes when we can just make tweaks, right? It's yeah, so that's where the excesses of some of these state laws that are coming out are definitely you know, we've moved far beyond voter ID territory into something else. So
yeah, now it's basically talking about securing the count. You know, we talk about securing the vote and making sure there's no voter suppression, but that you have to now watch over everybody's shoulder, making sure no one's going to essentially cheat and fudge the count. Maybe some of your engineering ideas will help that, will mitigate some of the damage of these laws. You know, perhaps.
You know, I'm not familiar with how all that many states do this. I mean, in terms of issues surrounding the counting of ballots, of course, I think almost all of those issues, all of those controversies were about recounts as opposed to counts. Okay, because the counts, anywhere you're using a machine, at the end of the day, you press a few buttons and it produces a paper tape that has the results on it. And that gets, at least in Connecticut, that literally gets posted on the wall in the polling place. And, you know, and those numbers end up getting transmitted to the registrar of voters in the town. And I mean, there's not a whole lot to see. There were a lot of questions surrounding the ability of there to be, you know, people observing those recounts, and of course, recounts are different from the original counts. But I don't think that having recording equipment covering all that sort of stuff is at all a bad idea. I think they had it in a lot of cases, but maybe there were some cases where they didn't. But I would think that recording those processes would, again, the idea is you really don't want people to be able to come along and say, well, we didn't get to watch it, so, you know, who knows what they did. Well, watch the tape. if you don't think that they're
in some of these laws, as I understand them, some of these that are trying to come in, they're trying to give poll watchers more more credence. It's increasing the power of the poll watcher, and that just can be voted. And I don't think it's poll watcher on the recount. It's poll watcher on the day, and that can easily lead to voter intimidation. So there are a lot of, as Sean Campbell said, a lot of laws that people are coming up with that don't seem to address the issue or perceived issues in a way that seems to suit the problem.
We have had these.
That's yeah.
We've actually had those. We've had those in Connecticut right along. I mean, I don't know when they started having them, but the election that I was actually a moderator, which it's, you know, one of the people who kind of just runs a voting place. And so I had to read up on how that worked, what I was supposed to do. And I learned that in Connecticut, we have these wonderfully archaic rules, or did at the time, that when a voter enters the voting place and goes up to the registration table where you're supposed to look and, you know, see that he's there on the rolls, that the person who's checking his ID, which by the way can be a gas bill, a utility bill can be used here, just so you know, has to speak his name loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Because in the room, you can have an observer from each party and a challenger from each party. And apparently the challengers have almost never challenged anyone. They're there to actually shout, no, that's not so-and-so who lives at such and such an address. And so it's been there, but it hasn't really been used. But I do agree that, you know, maybe in some more contested places, maybe that could be a problem, that you'd have somebody, you know, trying to disrupt the process just for the sake of disrupting it, and that sort of thing, you know, that just can't be allowed. That's bad. Well, guys, we have been at this for a couple of hours, and I think we've covered everything a little bit, at least on the outline. You know, does anyone have anything else you want to talk about? If so, say so.
Well, just one quick little story, just sort of, maybe should have mentioned it earlier, I don't know, but I think we all understood each other. I don't know, have any of you ever been to Selma?
I have not.
Selma, Alabama?
No.
No. It's like a required trip. Required. You just as soon as you get into the town, you just feel something different. They have a little voting rights museum there, and when you walk in, there's like usually a few older people. I had this one little old lady come up to me and say, "Oh, do you want me to explain some things? I'm one of the foot soldiers," and points to her name on the wall. That's what they called themselves. And during the marches, they were foot soldiers. And she had to be maybe 15, 17 at the time. And the way I view voting rights in the country is, if a law comes up that's going to make it harder for that woman to vote, then it's just plain and simple the wrong law. It's just plain and simple, because these are people who really, really fought for the right to vote. The thing that we just go in and, you know, at that time I was all 2 years old, but At that time, my mother and father were taking my older sister and older brother to the precinct, which was a public school, every election day, and just made sure they saw how you go into the booth, you flick the switches, did a whole thing. And we just grew up knowing, yeah, this is just a thing you do every Tuesday, every, few years. And, but there's a whole bunch of people who, had to get beaten with batons and water cannon, just to have that opportunity. So that's the only thing I think about with regard to voter rights is how does it affect those people who really went through it, who really fought for the right to vote.
Yeah, I thank you for reminding us of that. I think that it's certainly true that an awful lot of the issues that we have to deal with today, we wouldn't have to deal with if we hadn't done this badly for a long time with regard to, certain groups of people. So that's the extent to which we've inherited our father's sins, or an extent to which we have. Yeah. So shall we call it a day then? Is that are we good?
That's a good note to end on.
Okay, super. Yes, thank you for that. That's
Appreciate
terrific.
it.
Well, yeah, thank you all so much. I think this was great. I enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes.
And
Yeah, I had a blast. Everyone was so gracious and smart.
that's great. I will. So Sean Campbell and I are going to go start a political party. So we'll be contacting.
Excellent.
Thank you all so much.
All right. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks,
Bye.
Ben. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Sean.